Welcome to the penultimate webinar on the State Electronic Records Initiative Spring 2021 series. I'm Bonnie Weddle. I'm an accessioning archivist at the New York State Archives. I'm also the co-chair of SERI's Education and Programming Subcommittee. We're going to wrap up the spring webinar series on June 8th, when we'll focus on building a resume that highlights one's existing digital skills and one's ability and willingness to acquire new ones. We will continue to observe our traditional summer hiatus, so there won't be any SERI webinars in July or August. However, Education and Planning is busy putting together the Fall 2021 webinar series, so stay tuned. Next slide, please. This webinar series is one of a host of activities that the State Electronic Records Initiative is undertaking, and I'd just like to take a moment to recognize Preservica, SERI's 2021 sponsor. Preservica's support helps us sustain this webinar series and several SERI research projects, and it's also making it possible for several state archives to jumpstart their digital preservation programs. Next slide, please. On to today's event, which focuses on the National Finding Aid Network project. Our presenter, Adrian Turner, is the Senior Project Manager at the California Digital Library. He supports the strategic management of the Online Archive of California, or OAC, and Calisphere, two services administered by the California Digital Library's Publishing, Archives, and Digitization Group. Together, the OAC and Calisphere provide broad public access to unique collections maintained by libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural heritage organizations in California. He also supports collection management tools hosted by the CDL, Nuxeo, and ArchiveSpace for use by the University of California Libraries to steward unique collections. We will have a Q&A break in the middle of Adrian's presentation, but please feel free to enter your questions into the chat box at any time. Please make sure that they're addressed to everyone. And any questions that we don't get to during the mid-session break, we'll address at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Adrian.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Alrighty, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today on the webinar. And I am going to be highlighting a project. It's called Building a National Finding Aid Network, which we're abbreviating as NAFAN. And I want to thank COSA for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it. So my goal today is to introduce the project and provide an overview of the project objectives. And my intent is really just to establish the basis for an ongoing dialogue about the work with all of you. We're going to need a lot of help, a lot of input, and a lot of feedback along the way to help shape this vision that we're proposing for a National Finding Aid Network. And I should note that our project team, we hosted a community information session or a webinar just a few weeks ago on April 28th. And I'm going to be covering a lot of the same points today that I covered during that webinar. So if you attended that session, I'm sorry for the duplication, but I hope this is an opportunity to ask some follow-up questions if you didn't get a chance to ask at that session. So to kick things off, I'd like to provide some background for the project and then discuss our goals and objectives. And then do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the activity areas. There's 4 different activity areas that we've defined for the project, and I'm going to do a slightly deeper dive into our research activities. So building a National Finding Aid Network is a 2-year research and demonstration project that we've embarked on, and our goal is to address a fundamental challenge that we think is faced by researchers of all kinds. So they have significant barriers to locating relevant archival materials that are stewarded by cultural heritage institutions. And they're having a hard time accessing those materials through finding aids or collection descriptions that constitute inventories, narrative summaries of those materials. Some of these primary source materials, which range from organizational records to personal papers, photographs, ephemera, they may be in digital format, and a finding aid may be linking to those materials, but the vast majority of materials, as you know, are not in digital format, and the only way that a researcher would even know about them is through a finding aid. However, finding aids themselves can be difficult to find, and many institutions aren't able to, or they aren't currently publishing their finding aids online. And if they do, they have varying levels of success in making them visible to a broad community or making them available and broadly indexed by search engines like Google. Within our current landscape, there are a number of existing state and regional aggregations of finding aids that have historically made inroads into addressing these discoverability challenges. But these aggregations themselves are siloed. So typically they work within a regional or statewide area. So they serve institutions within a delimited geographical range. And many aggregators are also facing mounting technical debt with their systems that in some cases have been developed over the past 20 years. And compounding this problem, there are still thousands of cultural heritage institutions that aren't represented within these finding aid aggregations. Many organizations have finding aids in formats that aren't supported by aggregators, so they have finding aids or inventories that are in Word documents, spreadsheets, HTML pages, PDF files, and by and large, most of these aggregators are supporting encoded archival description or EAD encoded finding aids. So as a result, researchers face enormous barriers in locating relevant materials across this real vast, distributed, and unevenly supported field of cultural heritage institutions. And then the voices that are documented within those records are poorly represented. So my organization, the California Digital Library, we maintain a service. It's called the Online Archive of California, or OAC. And what we've been doing since early 2000 is bringing together finding aids across the state. And that's sort of how OAC started as that with that vision, and that's sort of still the core function today. Leading up to about 2018, we've been reevaluating the scope and sustainability of the OAC, and we've wanted to modernize the back-end infrastructure, and there's a lot that we can do on the front end to modernize it. But before embarking on a major upgrade of the OAC, we thought this would be a real timely opportunity to step back and convene a broader conversation with other regional and statewide finding aid aggregators to broach the idea of a more shared infrastructure and service model. In late 2018, we received 1 year of LSTA funding from the California State Library to explore this idea with other aggregators, and to explore this vision of a national finding aid network. And that planning initiative, it launched with research to analyze and really get a current sense of the landscape of finding aid aggregation within the U.S. And that those findings were summarized in this report. It's titled Finding Aid Aggregation at a Crossroads. I'm going to drop in a link to the project wiki, and there's a link to reports and findings, so you'll see a link to the document there. Sort of midway through the project and towards the end, we began to formulate an action plan with recommendations for a phased and near to longer term set of steps that we could collectively take that would move from basically a research and demonstration set of project activities towards realizing something that might be more of a program and sustainable network that would be national in scale. So, and that action plan is also linked from the wiki. And in that action plan, we proposed a high-level set of functions for the network, and they're sort of represented here in these dark orange rectangular shapes. So just summarizing some of the key functions that we envisioned, it needs to support meaningful, low barrier and inclusive pathways for participation by any cultural heritage institution in the US, and it needs to support a broad range of finding aid formats. We can't limit participation just to institutions that can generate EAD encoded finding aids. Another core function, it needs to include an extensive and continually updated registry of institutions, regardless of whether or not they have finding aids. The idea is that this should be a search and browsable registry or directory of institutions to increase the awareness of among researchers of organizational profiles and holdings. So that's that sort of registry of repository function in the middle. It should serve as either a primary or a supplemental publication platform for institutions that contribute finding aids. So some institutions already run finding aid systems like ArchiveSpace, and they don't need they already have a solution in place for getting their finding aids online. But there are a lot of institutions that don't have that sort of infrastructure and could really benefit from having a publication platform. So it should also support some tools and contributor support services to make it easy to contribute and create and publish finding aids. And then sort of the last set of functions is that these finding aids should support interlinking with related content. So these might be digital versions of the materials that are in a digital asset management system, or it could be digital content that's, for say, in DPLA. And it should also support interlinking of these finding aids with related context. And one of the key platforms would be the Social Networks and Archival Context, or SNAC platform, which is bringing together information about individuals, families, and organizations that are either referenced in archival descriptions or the creators or contributors of those collections. So this action plan is really the basis for the current NAFAN R&D project, which is supported with funding by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which we'd really like to thank for helping us get this off the ground. My organization, the CDL, we're coordinating this two-year project, and it runs through late 2022, and we're collaborating with a group of organizations that are taking the lead on different activity areas. So we're working closely with the Chainbridge Group, OCLC, Shift Collective, and the University of Virginia Library. And we're also working in close partnership with extant finding aid aggregators. So we have 4 key activity areas. There's research, technical assessments, community building and engagement, and sustainability planning. And so our research activities are really focused on end user and contributor needs in relation to finding aid aggregations. And we also want to evaluate the current quality of existing structured finding aid data. The technical assessment activity is really focused on evaluating potential systems that could support the different network functions. And we also want to formulate a set of requirements that are going to serve as a blueprint that we would reference to actually build out this network in a subsequent implementation phase. Community building and broad engagement. So we want to engage broadly with you, with individuals that are working and volunteering in at organizations that are stewarding archival materials to get your input and feedback and help us shape this vision. And last, we're conducting market research and some business modeling to identify some viable sustainability and governance strategies for this network. So those are the key activity areas. And we have several different deliverables by the end of this project. So some of the key deliverables include our research findings. So those are going to be published documents or reports. We're envisioning that we're going to be creating some potential prototype systems or demonstrations. They could even be wireframes in some cases that could show or demonstrate what different functions of how different functions of the network would work like in practice. But you know, these are prototype systems that they wouldn't be sort of production systems, things that we could sort of quickly pull together and get off the ground to demonstrate or test a feature, and then you know we might cast it by the wayside when we actually build the real thing. As I mentioned earlier, we want to have a documented set of requirements that would serve as a blueprint for building this thing out in a subsequent phase. And we want to have a set of proposed business, governance, and organizational models that would launch and sustain this network. Our work is guided by our values and principles statement, and this is posted on the project wiki. They're an ongoing reference point for us to keep us oriented and really purposeful in our approach. Again, we want to support meaningful, inclusive, and low barrier pathways for participation by the broadest range of cultural heritage institutions in the US. And sorry, this is a little bit hard to see, but we've launched 3 initial advisory and working group structures to guide our work and to support the activity areas. So as I mentioned earlier, we're collaborating with extant finding aid aggregators. So there are currently 12 extant finding aid aggregations in the US, and we have a aggregator partners working group that includes representatives from these aggregations. We have a research advisory group to advise on our research strategies, and a technical advisory working group to advise on our technical assessment strategies. And I should note that the archive space team at Lyrasis is also serving as a technical consulting partner. And once we're at the point where we're sort of have a clearer idea in terms of how this system might work, we're gonna want to engage the archive space team to help us evaluate different sort of data flow models for sharing finding aid data from archive space into a national aggregation. There's a lot of different ways that could potentially work. And before I go into each activity area, I'm just gonna really pause here for any questions that you have. You can feel free to post them through the chat.
I know folks might need a few seconds to type, but I just, this isn't a question, but it is a comment. It really strikes me that your emphasis on sustainability, on low barriers to entry, parallel in a really nice way the sort of evolution that digital preservation projects are taking. That there's much more emphasis on being sure that the commitments we make can be honored over the long term, and that we're not building systems that are suitable only for those institutions that have expansive budgets and lots of staff and sophisticated technical infrastructures. That there need to be options for everybody.
Definitely, this is going to be a dynamic that we're considering. I mean, we don't know what this is going to cost to run and resource and sustain this. And I should note, I mean, this is part of sort of thinking about the design is we want whatever we build out, we want this to be as efficient and sort of low cost as possible as well. So, but yeah, as far as the sustainability consideration, we've participated in projects and we've observed projects where sustainability is sort of a factor or consideration that happens after something is built and launched and whatnot. And even though we don't know what this thing exactly looks like yet, we want to factor in sustainability planning right from the start. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, but we wanted to factor that in right out the gates.
Great. Adrian, we do have one question. Michelle would like to learn more about how the Directory of Archives will be kept up to date.
Yeah, thanks for asking about the registry. This is sort of one of the core functions where we're starting to really try to unpack from a technical perspective how this might work, whether it's sort of a standalone registry, which would have its own considerations, or if we're sort of syncing with data from existing registry sources. And I think one sort of existing de facto registry is the SNAC, Social Networks and Archival Context, does have a de facto sort of set of in a pretty expansive set of information about cultural heritage institutions within the US. So I think what we would design would, whether it's standalone or potentially integrated or drawing on data from an existing registry system, it would need to factor in options to refresh that data, and institutions that are represented in the registry should have pathways to be able to update those records. Yeah, we don't want this data to get stale. But yeah, it's I think a lot of TBDs in terms of how exactly that works. But in principle, yeah, the keeping it up to date the institution should have the wherewithal to be able to do that, and there should be very sort of simple ways to maintain or update data.
Okay, thanks. Adrian, that looks like that's the only question we have at the moment. Folks, if you have any other questions or if questions arise during the presentation, just enter them into the chat box and we will take care of them at the end.
All right, so I'm going to just touch on the different activity areas. So there were 4 of them, and I'm going to do a slightly deeper dive into our research plan. So OCLC is leading the research activities, and our colleagues Chayla Scott Weber is serving as the project manager. Lynn Conaway is leading the design of the research activities, and Leslie Lenga is also coordinating and conducting the activities. There is a broader team of OCLC colleagues who are assisting, and that broader team is listed on the project wiki. OCLC, they bring a lot of experience working with archives and archival data. They have a long history with developing and prototyping and launching systems like Archive Grid, and they also support special collections and archives within their research library partnership program. And they do have, within, especially on the research side of the house, a lot of expertise with conducting research on behalf of special collections, archives, and the broader library community. So it's really terrific to have them on board. So we have 2 main goals in our research activities, and the first goal involves gaining a current understanding of the needs of researchers as well as the needs of cultural heritage institutions in relation to finding aid aggregation. And the second involves gaining a current understanding of the quality of existing structured finding aid data at scale. As we were preparing for this project, OCLC conducted an initial literature review to identify what kinds of user research had been done in the past, and around finding aid aggregation really found that it was pretty limited and just limited in scope, and a lot of the research is really focused on user interactions with finding aids. So with particular finding aid sites or finding aid display systems, there's been a fairly heavy academic user emphasis, but again, not much in the way of research on finding aid aggregations themselves and user interactions with aggregate information. They also did a review of personas to inform that informed the creation of different finding aid display systems. And by personas, I'm referring to a term that's used within the context of user-centered design. So personas are sketches or representations of user types that might typically interact with a particular website or a platform. And so there's been some recent and strong work on archival personas, primarily in the service of software projects. And so examples include Project Electron, ArcLight, Archives West, Archive Space. And so the OCLC team looked at those personas and some commonalities across them. So as part of the NAFAN research activities, we want to get a sense of the degree to which those personas align with users of finding aid aggregations, and really ultimately just sharpen our sense of who's actually using finding aid aggregations so we can focus the design of the system to support those audiences and their research needs and research inquiries. And so there's 3 different research focal points, again, focusing on researchers, cultural heritage institution needs, and then the finding aid data quality. So I'm going to go through each of these and the data collection and analysis methods and the different sort of research questions that are tied to each of these focuses. So the first focus area is on researchers themselves, end users that are seeking information about collections, and they're using finding aids or they're stumbling on finding aids and trying to make sense of what they are and you know, trying to access materials. So our main research questions involve understanding who are current users of finding aid aggregations, and we want to understand the benefits and the challenges that those users face when searching or landing in a finding aid aggregation. And yeah, again, the benefits and challenges that they're facing. So to try to get at these questions, we've put out a pop-up survey into the field, and this pop-up survey is currently being hosted by our Finding Aid Aggregator partners. So just as an example, if you go to the Online Archive of California site now, you'll see, you may stumble across a pop-up survey. It's sort of randomized, it'll pop up. And you'll see that on other Finding Aid Aggregator sites as well. So this is an exploratory survey, and the OCLC team is really using it to gather a convenient sample of data. The survey gets at information about researcher demographics, so it includes some questions to ask about, you know, what are they looking for, and ask some demographic information as well as what kinds of what kind of resources they're looking for. And it's also, the survey is also going to help us identify people who would be willing to take part in semi-structured interviews that are going to be organized by OCLC. And those semi-structured interviews are going to help us get further into their information seeking goals and needs. These interviews, they're going to be recorded, then transcribed. OCLC is going to be coding and analyzing those interviews. They're using an application called NVivo. And then they're also going to be analyzing the pop-up survey demographic information using descriptive statistics. So these are going to be, virtual interviews. They're anticipating about 25 interviews. And again, really sort of also seeing if these individuals map to personas that have been established from other, you know, archival finding aid projects or not. The second research focus is on cultural heritage institutions. And here we have several different research, like high-level research questions. We want to understand what are the enabling as well as what are the constraining factors that influence whether or not an institution describes the archival collections. What are the enabling and constraining factors that influence whether they contribute to an aggregator? And last, what value does participating in an aggregation bring to that institution? So to address these questions, OCLC is going to be organizing focus group interviews with individuals who are working in or volunteering in a variety of types and sizes of cultural heritage institutions in the US. And again, OCLC is going to be recording these focus group sessions. We'll be transcribing the information and then coding those transcriptions and analyzing them using NVivo. And what we're really trying to do is identify the expectations and the needs of cultural heritage institutions in relation to aggregation. So we're going to be talking to individuals that are already participating in aggregations, but also we want to talk to individuals who are at organizations that aren't participating in aggregations. We want to understand what their considerations are and what kinds of blockers and challenges they're facing. So the third research focus area is on existing finding aid data quality, and we're looking at finding aid data that has already been brought together by existing finding aid aggregators. So we want to get a sense of what's the current sort of finding aid data quality look like. We want to get a sense of the structure and the consistency of the data across finding aids and get a sense of whether or not that data can support the needs that are identified through the user research. So the way this is working right now is we've gathered about 145,000 finding aid files from existing aggregator partners. and these are primarily, pretty much in EAD format, and OCLC is currently doing a first pass analysis of the data. And this first pass analysis, it's involving a whole heck of a lot of counting and reviewing the finding aid data elements to look at the occurrences of those data elements and the consistency of those elements to see if what kinds of trends, or do we see any trends? Do we see sort of alignment in encoding practice or not? And then a second and later round of analysis is going to involve looking at the content of what's encoded in those elements. And once we have some initial end user research findings, that'll help us sort of project what we think the data can and can't support. So as I mentioned earlier, we're seeking participants for focus group sessions, and we recently put out a call for candidates, and I'd just like to reiterate that call here. It's still open, and you can find a link to the survey on the NAFAN project wiki. I think it's off to the right-hand side. There's an announcement about that. So yeah, again, if you work or if you volunteer at a library, archive, museum, historical society, or you have colleagues that are working in those contexts that steward archival materials, and if you're interested and your organization is interested in providing broader access to your collections by making your finding aids available online, then we'd encourage you to volunteer. And again, there's a link to the sign up form. That SurveyMonkey form will sort of is the place where you can indicate your interest in participating in the focus group. All right, a little bit of a dive into the technical assessment and prototyping work. So the leads on this activity area are my colleague Brian Tingle at the California Digital Library, Daniel Pitti and Keith Bossert at the University of Virginia Library are also leading the work. So the goal of this particular activity area is to do due diligence of existing systems and platforms that could support the functions of NAFAN. If there are existing systems that are out there that we can adapt, we want to test and see, how that might work and what that might look like. And I mentioned earlier, we want to do some prototyping of some of the functions to assess the feasibility of those functions and also demonstrate to the community how those functions might work. And more generally, we want to get a sense of the costs and benefits of taking different approaches and what the value that those different approaches might be able to bring. So again, before we're sort of committing to building anything, we want to do some testing and assessment of potential options. And then last, we want to formulate requirements for this system. So that's going to be a documented set of requirements that'll basically serve as this blueprint for developing what we're, I think, envisioning. It's going to be sort of like a minimum viable product or like a initial version of this platform that would be built out in a subsequent development phase. So here's this functional requirement diagram again from our 2018 and 19 planning phase of the project. So these functional requirements are serving as our starting point, and what we want to do is really sort of unpack these further and embellish them. And so far, we have been honing on this registry function as sort of a real sort of key function that a lot of the other sort of functions will be informed by and sort of predicated on. So we are starting to look at some potential data models for the registry and then technologies and workflows that could support this function. And we're right now starting to look at the social networks and archival context, or SNAC data, as a potential data source for the registry information. And we've also started work on drafting a very, very initial sort of outline of the functional requirements, and these are at a real formative stage. So we're going to be honing it with our project team as well as with our finding aid aggregation partners and working groups. But ultimately, we want to get this into a state for sharing for broader review and input. So we would love to be able to get this out even as an early draft to start to get your feedback and take on it, because this will really hopefully start to clarify what this platform and network would look like from a functional perspective. And so again, by the end of the project, our goal is to have a real clear and set of requirements that would serve as this blueprint for building out the network. So community engagement activities, sort of the third activity area. Our colleagues, Burgess Jules, John Voss, and Aaron Glasgow from Shift Collective are supporting this aspect of the NAFAN project. And we really have two main drivers for our community engagement activities. So we want to be able to practice transparency about the project, our activities, and our deliverables. And we also want to support equitable participation in the project. So we're really mindful that this project is sort of originating out of, and it's being coordinated by organizations like the California Digital Library, where I'm at, that are situated within an academic context. It's like an academic research library environment. But we want this network and this platform really to support and benefit our organizations and communities beyond that space, this academic space. And so we've been working with our colleagues at Shift Collective to map out ways to reach groups beyond the academic library environment, as well as, we want to get to public library archives, community archives, government archives. So COSA is a perfect forum to be able to talk about the project, and a number of smaller organizations that may have descriptions of collections, may or may not have finding aids, and really could potentially benefit from getting broader visibility for their collections by making their finding aids in a national level aggregation. So some of the things that we're going to be doing is hosting an ongoing series of openly available information webinars, such as the one that we hosted on the 28th of April. We are going to be presenting at regional and national archival organization conferences. So that includes Society of American Archivists, that's happening like August later this year. But we know that not everyone is a member or can register for those events. And so we want to provide other open and free venues to really share and discuss our project activities. We're planning to host at least 2 community workshops as venues to engage on specific project outputs and proposed design ideas. And we're thinking that these workshops will really be an opportunity to engage with individuals at organizations, again, that aren't situated within an academic research library environment or within those networks. And we want to explore, how NAFAN could benefit them and really get direct input on how to design this platform. We don't have the information about these workshops as far as when we're going to host them, but we will definitely be sure to share them as they get developed. We're also building out our communications channels to get the word out about project activities. So we're sharing information about the project through regional, statewide, library archive, mailing lists, but we're also trying to get our own mailing list together, and we have a community Slack, and I'll share those links in a moment, and would encourage you to subscribe, because we could really use your help in getting the word out to your colleagues and to networks that you're participating in that are sort of outside, the regional, state, or organization orbits. All right, and the last activity area just to highlight is the sustainability planning activities. So Raim Crow at Chain Bridge Group is leading this part of the project, and we have sustainability in mind right from the start. So our goal is really to test the value proposition of a fully realized network against hypothetical operating cost requirements. And we really want to, the functional requirements, the sort of game plan for building the system needs to be scaled and calibrated based on the community resources that are able to sustain it. And so this is really critical given this sort of chronic under-resourcing to date of finding aid discoverability and access systems. So to date, Raim has been conducting some early business and market analysis investigations, and we've started to sketch out some initial value propositions for NAFAN for a range of different stakeholders. And in parallel, RAM has also been assessing existing operating models for finding aid aggregations. And so he's been mining a lot of the data from the 2018-19 investigation phase. And he's also looking at the current resourcing dynamics for aggregators that are sort of at a more macro level, like SNAC, namely, and Archive Grid, that aren't sort of bringing together archival description data at a regional or statewide level, but doing it at a more national, in some cases, like Archive Grid, international in scope. So the value propositions for NAFAN, they're still being refined. Once we have a stabilized version, our intent really is, again, to share them. We want to get broad input and feedback on them. So please stay tuned on that front. So I guess before getting into questions, just summarizing some key ways that you can start to get involved and track and engage with us on the project. So just to reiterate, that call for participation in the focus groups, you can find it linked from the NAFAN project wiki. And we hope you'll consider responding to that call and or encourage your colleagues to consider participating. As I mentioned earlier, we're developing a mailing list, which we'll use to send periodic updates about the project, as well as the informational sessions, the community workshops. So we'll be distributing that information through other venues as well, but the mailing list we'd love to build that out. So I'd encourage you to subscribe. And there's a get involved link off the project wiki where you can get to that information. As I mentioned earlier, we're using Slack. Right now we're using it really within our project team, but we also have a public channel there and would welcome your participating in that public channel. So we'll be sharing information through Slack if you're inclined to meet us there. And there's information on the project wiki for signing up. And last, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the project. We're at nafan@ucop.edu, and that's also linked off of the wiki. So with that, I've been talking a lot. I'll just go ahead and I guess hold for Q&A and Rebecca and Bonnie, I guess turn it over back to you.
Okay, Adrian, we do actually have one question from Michelle, who thinks that the idea of an institution gaining value from participating in an aggregation service is a smart thing to pursue. Do you have any hunches, ideas as to what kind of value you think that they're going to report?
Yeah, I think hunches would be that participating in an aggregation brings your collections in conversation with other institutions' collections. So we know that, right, holdings aren't sort of holdings documenting a particular topic or particular topic aren't sort of just solely bounded by a given institution's holdings. I mean, they connect with other resources that are managed by other institutions. So being part of an aggregation links your collections up with other related materials. I think maybe the other key pieces that aggregations have tried to really do a lot to make the finding aids that they're hosting more discoverable. So, putting a lot of time and investment into search engine optimization, trying to get finding aids indexed. So it's sort of aggregation serve as an additional discovery point. As a way for users, who might just be searching on the open web to find your collections by, just, through a Google search or a Bing search or whatnot, getting to your finding aids that way. So I think there's a sort of discoverability value that aggregations can bring.
Okay, great. Give everyone just a few minutes to enter their questions. Oh, a question from Jesse. To what extent do you foresee being able to pull data from existing descriptions, regardless of format or structure, or conversely, how much will you have to encourage institutions to upgrade their descriptions?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think in principle, and going back to those early functional requirements and thinking about, what this network needs to be able to do, I think we really want to support as much as possible bringing together existing finding aids, regardless of format or structure. So not requiring, sort of data munging or upgrading of that finding aid data to get it into a different format in order to get to this system. I mean, we know that is now a barrier for many institutions to participate in aggregations. For example, OAC, we host EAD files, we host PDF files, we host MARC records, but there are a lot of institutions that don't have those formats, and they have finding aids in, or inventories that are in spreadsheets or finding aids that are posted as HTML pages. And right now we don't have a way to support those institutions to bring those finding aids through, even though they're perfectly serviceable, they're searchable, and they should be discoverable within these aggregations. So that is, I think that is the goal as much as possible to support finding aid data within existing formats without requiring, sort of getting them into a different format in order to get into this system.
Great. I actually have a follow-up about that, but I'm going to hold off because we have a couple of other questions. Veronica would just like a brief review of the project's sustainability and governance strategies. She just wants a little clarification.
Sure. So with the sustainability and governance strategies, we want to, by the end of this 2-year research and demonstration phase, have a pretty good idea of potential models for what kind of resources will be needed to build and launch this network, and then what kinds of resources would be needed to sustain it. A lot of projects like this, they start with seed funding from grant agencies, but they can't be sustained that way. And so we need to really think right from the start in terms of how to resource this, whatever we build and design on an ongoing basis, and whatever we build and design needs to be sort of scaled to what institutions are willing to do to support it. So the sustainability planning is really to help us sort of get a clearer picture in terms of what are some potential resourcing models to get this up and going and to build it out, and then related, what kinds of potential governance models would be needed to get it off the ground and also to support this moving forward. I think, are hoping that this would be a community sustained and a community governed network. So it's not just sort of like one organization doing this. But like many projects, it may need some key organizations to help sort of incubate and get it off the ground. So that's sort of the sustainability and governance planning. We've seen that some of that work usually happens after sort of a project is launched and something is built and put out there. And what we wanted to do is sort of start thinking about that really early in the process. So I hope that helps.
Yes, she says in the chat it did. We also have a question from Linda. Some small volunteer-run organizations are reluctant to include their holdings in online tools because they don't have any consistent way to provide access to the material. This may be a little bit far in the future, but do you anticipate adding some tools that would allow for digital surrogates from repositories that may not be able to provide in-person access to materials that they're describing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're envisioning is that as a function, the finding aids that we're bringing together in this aggregation should be able to link to digital surrogates. I think scoping wise, we're not envisioning that those digital surrogates would live in this system. They would be living somewhere else, again, like DPLA, or maybe there's a digital asset management system that the institution is hosting their digital objects, or they put them in Flickr Commons or wherever those digital assets live. But the finding aid should be able to, we should have some protocols and ways to sort of support the interlinking of those finding aids with those digital assets.
Great. I indicated a moment ago that I had a follow-up question to Jesse's question, and in terms of, harmonizing things, in terms of consistency, there are a lot of institutions that, use Library of Congress subject headings, pull terms from art and architecture thesaurus, and there are plenty that don't. And has the project, talked about, any potential ways to, streamline and, introduce at least some degree of standardization, so that, we just don't have people, using their folksonomies, as nice as folksonomies may be, as appropriate as they may be in some instances, but just from a user's perspective, it's helpful to know that, Susie Jameson and Suzanne Jameson Thompson are the same person, and her papers may be scattered across multiple institutions.
Yeah, I think this will hopefully come out through some of the user research. It's definitely something we don't have the answer yet, but thinking about in terms of the functional requirements. I mean, we're suspecting that it would be helpful to have support things like topical browse of collections. And then, then how would we do that? Is there sort of, do we need controlled vocabularies, or does that leverage sort of existing data? So I think there's still, a lot to unpack there. I think this is going to be a real, to design a system, that'll sort of support as a broad range of formats where we are not sort of prescribing, an extensive set of requirements. I think we're gonna have to figure out how to sort of balance the functionality. Knowing that, again, there are going to be a lot of finding aids that will not have that kind of information, but those finding aids are perfectly serviceable. And again, right now, maybe totally invisible because they're not in these networks. So I think, we are going to have to, that's a dynamic that we're going to have to figure out. But our sort of, in principle, our intent is to support the broadest range of formats.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. We'll give everyone just a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, to add any last minute questions. Going once, going twice. Okay, Becky, could you give me the next slide, please? Okay, that's just a wrap-up slide, and if you could advance it just once again. All right, I'd just like to encourage you to stay connected and informed, either via COSA's website. COSA is also on Twitter and on Facebook. And you'll see updates about the Fall 2021 webinar series and other events on all of those resources. And if you give me the final slide. All right, when you close out of this webinar, you will see a SurveyMonkey form open. We would really appreciate it if you completed it. It takes just a couple of minutes to do so, and when you click send, it does not go off into the wilds of cyberspace, never to be seen again. The Education and Programming Subcommittee does review them, and we do take your feedback into account when planning future webinars. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you again, Adrian. This is a very interesting project, and we appreciate your keeping us up to date on it. So thanks, everyone.